I sent the text from the airport tarmac, the wheels of the transport plane still hot. Arriving at 11:40, Gate B6. Mom misses you. 14 months in a military rehabilitation center. 11 surgeries. I had made it back. But as I sat in the designated waiting area, watching the automatic doors swish open and shut, no one came. Not my son, Mark, and certainly not his wife, Chloe, the woman I'd helped raise their children. I sat alone in my uniform, a ghost at a feast of reunions, as families swirled around me in bursts of laughter and tears. Maybe they thought I would die on that operating table, a convenient exit from their lives. But I came home, and what I did next, I have never told a soul until now. I had pictured it so differently. After all the sterile white walls, the hollow echo of my own breathing, the relentless silent pain in that hospital, I thought someone would be there. I wasn't expecting balloons or a welcome banner, just a familiar face. A voice that sounded like home, anything human. All I received was the indifferent hiss of conditioned air and the squeal of luggage wheels on tile. I had asked for one thing, just one. I texted them as a mother who believed she still had a place in their world. Not a plea, not a demand, just a simple message. Arriving at 11:40, Gate B6, Mom misses you. That morning, a young corporal had wheeled me to the transport van, his eyes soft with a professional pity. I still had stitches under my coat, the scars too raw to press against a seat belt. 14 months and 11 surgeries. I had learned to move again, not to walk, not anymore, but to balance, to transfer my weight, to exist on wheels. I told him I would be fine from here. It was a lie. Gate B6 was a kaleidoscope of joyful greetings, flowers, tight hugs, happy squeals, and signs that read, "Welcome home, Dad." None of them were for me. I sat there for 47 minutes. I counted. The transport driver offered to wait longer, but I waved him off. Pride is a strange thing. It can show up even when your legs don't. A couple across from me bickered about whether their flight was early. A teenage girl wept into a handmade poster. A toddler sprinted toward a man in fatigues shouting, "Daddy!" And I had to swallow the sound that tried to crawl up my throat. My hands trembled as I checked my phone again. No response. I checked the signal, the time, the contact I'd sent it to. Everything was correct except for the part where anyone cared. I had 2 sons. Mark was the eldest, married to Chloe, a woman whose words were as polished and cold as marble. She had a way of speaking that made you feel foolish for questioning her. She once told me I should let go of archaic ways when I mentioned I preferred paper checks over online banking. Then there was David, quieter, always living in his brother's shadow. He called on birthdays and texted when reminded. He never disrespected me, but he never defended me either. Neither of them came, not even a text message with an excuse, just silence. The wheels of my chair squeaked a lonely rhythm as I made my way to the taxi stand. The driver, a man with a kind, weary face, looked at me with surprise but said nothing. I gave him the address. He nodded and held the door open. I didn't ask for help getting in. We drove in silence. The highway out of Seattle was lined with autumn trees, their leaves a riot of gold and crimson. Flags flew at half-mast for a politician I didn't know. The world kept moving, indifferent. My name, it seemed, was no longer carved into anyone's memory. Not in that family. As we neared my neighborhood in Port Madison, I told the driver to stop 4 blocks early. He looked confused, but a $20 tip smoothed his brow. I needed to see it from a distance. The house looked the same. Pale gray paint, white trim, the American flag on the porch, slightly faded by the salt air. 2 cars were parked in the driveway. One of them was mine, or at least it used to be. Chloe had been staying there while I was gone. It made sense, she'd said. It was practical. They would maintain it for me. I had believed her. From behind the cover of a neighbor's hedge, I watched. A woman stepped onto my porch, wearing my robe, my silk robe. She held a glass of wine and laughed into her phone. The porch lights flickered on automatically. Someone had reset the timer. Someone had claimed my space, piece by piece. I didn't cry. I wish I could say I did, that it would have felt like some kind of release. But what I felt was colder and sharper than sadness. It was an emptiness that begged to be filled. If you have ever been erased by the people you gave everything to, then maybe you understand what came next. I didn't ring the doorbell. I didn't knock. I turned my chair around, rolled away, and opened a part of myself that had lain dormant for years. The part that had learned how to wait, how to strategize, and how to take back everything without ever raising my voice. Because sometimes being unwanted is the most profound freedom there is, and I intended to use it. That night, I checked into a small motel off the Pacific Highway. No one knew I was in town. I paid in cash. The walls were thin and the mattress sagged, but it afforded me something priceless: time to think. The next morning I went to the bank, not the local branch where the tellers used to greet me by name, but the main office downtown. A different clerk, a sterile, professional smile. I asked to review the activity on my accounts, the ones tied to the house. She typed for a moment, then paused, her eyes widening slightly. I saw it before she said a word. Something was wrong. Withdrawals I hadn't authorized. Transfers I'd never approved. A new savings account opened under a trust name that sounded vaguely familiar. They had used my power of attorney. The one I'd signed before the first surgery. The one Mark had said was just in case. There it was. Not theft, but betrayal. Neat, clean, and meticulously documented. They had used my recovery as a window of opportunity to systematically dismantle my life. Chloe had moved into the house 2 weeks after my second operation. By the 5th, Mark had rerouted the utilities and transferred the title of my second car. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. I asked for the statements to be printed, took them in a manila folder, and walked out as if I were merely running errands. From there, I visited the lawyer who had handled my late husband's estate. His name was Mr. Henderson, a man with a sharp mind and an immaculate desk. He blinked when he saw me. He said they'd told him I was in critical condition, that my cognitive functions were declining. He showed me the emails, the signed forms, the carefully phrased communications from Chloe. She had requested updates on my condition while simultaneously asking for assistance with succession planning. They were preparing my estate while I was still breathing. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, his voice low. He said he hadn't acted on any of it yet. He was waiting for something more official, but they had been circling, waiting for the silence to become permanent. That silence was now over. I left his office and went to the storage unit I had rented years ago. Inside were boxes of old paperwork, the deed to my grandmother's cottage on Orcas Island, and a locked tin holding copies of every legal document I had ever signed. I sat on a folding chair in the dim light and read through each one, page by page, searching for leverage, for my name, for what was still mine. By the time I left, the sun had set. I drove back toward the coast and parked a few blocks from my house. I watched them again through the shadows, through the windows left open to the cool evening air. They were laughing, they were pouring wine. They lived as if the woman who had built that life for them had never existed. I could hear my grandchildren inside, one of them calling for Chloe. The sound was a knife twisting slowly. The next day, I hired a new lawyer, one I found myself. Her name was Isabel Reed, young, sharp, and efficient. She didn't flinch when I rolled into her office. She'd handled cases like this before. I gave her everything: the power of attorney documents, the bank statements, the trust forms, the text messages. She nodded, her eyes scanning each page with clinical precision. She said we would begin with an immediate revocation. We could freeze assets, trigger audits, and reassert ownership. But the thing that stayed with me was what she said near the end. "This isn't just about property, Eleanor," she said, her voice firm. "This is about identity. They erased you on paper. It's time to write yourself back in." We filed everything within 48 hours. I remained silent. I let the law move first, quiet but heavy, like a tide rolling in under a dark moon. But legal action was just the beginning. It wasn't enough to reclaim what they had tried to steal. I wanted them to feel it, to understand it, to sit with it, just as I had sat alone at Gate B6. They thought I was gone. Now, I would show them what it looked like when a woman they buried too soon rose from the grave. The legal wheels were turning, slow and inexorable, but I knew that some wars are fought on multiple fronts. Mine would be a battle of both law and silence. I remained at the motel, an invisible presence in my own city. Every morning I left early and returned late, mapping their routines. Mark left for work at 8:15 a.m., always in a pressed navy blazer, his phone glued to his ear. He drove my silver sedan, the one I'd bought myself when I turned 65. Chloe's gym schedule was sacred. She would leave around 10 a.m. in expensive yoga pants and return 2 hours later, a green smoothie in hand. She sometimes wore my old silk scarf, the one my husband Paul gave me for our 35th anniversary. She didn't wear it like it held a memory. She wore it like she owned it. By the end of the first week, I knew everything: who came and went, what deliveries were made, which friends stopped by for wine on the deck. They had turned my home into their base of operations. What they didn't know was that I still had a key, a single copy, hidden years ago in an old recipe tin in my storage unit. Late one evening, I used it. I waited until the house was dark and silent. I rolled down the side path, carefully avoiding the motion sensors I myself had installed. I knew their blind spots. The key turned smoothly in the lock. They hadn't bothered to change it. Not out of trust, but because they had forgotten I existed, I moved through the house like a phantom. My bedroom was unrecognizable. The photographs of Paul in his uniform were gone. My books were boxed up in the garage, replaced with her wellness guides and essential oils. The kitchen smelled of basil and bleach. The china I inherited from my mother was nowhere to be seen. I opened every drawer, searching for a trace of myself. Nothing. Then I saw it on the hallway table, a stack of mail. One envelope was addressed to me from the Department of Veterans Affairs, an annual benefits notice. Unopened. They had let it sit there for weeks. I took it, and I took more than that. In the office, I found the original Living Trust paperwork. I replaced it with a subtly altered decoy, just enough to cause chaos if they tried to use it again. Then I left as quietly as I had come. The next morning, I made my move. I contacted the community liaison at the local Veteran Support Center, a woman named Maria. We had met once at a fundraiser years ago. She remembered my name. I told her I was looking to make a donation to a special program, one that provided transitional housing for female veterans recovering from injury. She said they had been dreaming of such a project. They had a waiting list, a desperate need. I offered them my house. I explained the legal limbo, that my family had occupied it under false pretenses. She listened, her expression unreadable. Then she said something that stopped my breath. Most people don't give away their homes unless they're trying to reclaim themselves. I left that meeting with a timeline. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, I would take back what was mine and transform it into something no one could ever steal again. Meanwhile, I made quiet calls to old friends, a retired judge, a notary who owed me a favor. Piece by piece, I gathered my strength. I sent a formal notice to Chloe via courier, a gentle reminder that her occupancy was temporary and that the name on the deed was under dispute. I imagined her reading it, a smirk on her face, a glass of wine in her hand. Mark called me that night, the first contact since I landed. He didn't leave a message. I didn't call back. The next morning, Isabel filed a motion to freeze the house from any sale or refinancing. She also filed the formal revocation of the power of attorney. Legally, they were trapped, but I hadn't touched them emotionally yet. That would come later. For now, I watched from the shadows. My house was still standing, but I wasn't in it, not yet. And when I did return, it wouldn't be through the front door. It would be through fire. I didn't send the invitations myself. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I had Maria do it through the Veteran Center's event coordinator. The event was a commemorative dinner to honor a small group of long-term donors. That part was true. I had made the donation. What Mark and Chloe didn't know was that this dinner was also a stage, and I was the playwright. It was held in the oak room of a historic downtown hotel. Stone fireplaces, solid wood chairs, a long walnut table dressed in white linen. I asked Maria to invite my family as individual guests, to make them feel important, even smug. I wanted them completely off guard. I wore a simple navy dress, modest but tailored. They arrived late, of course. Chloe's laugh was too loud, cutting through the low murmur of conversation. Mark nodded at other guests as if he were their host. It took him 3 full minutes to see me. He froze mid-step. It was just a flicker, but I caught it. He was not expecting to see my face across that table. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I simply held his gaze. My moment came after the main course was cleared. The lights dimmed. The event coordinator stood to introduce a special speaker, a longtime donor and decorated military widow who had quietly launched a new housing initiative for wounded female veterans. My name was spoken clearly into the microphone. I stood, and for the first time in over a year, I felt every head in the room turn toward me with respect. I want to thank this community, I began, my voice steady, not for what it gave me, but for what it allowed me to reclaim after being discarded and forgotten. Tonight, I want to return something that was never meant to be mine alone. I paused, turning my head slightly toward Mark and Chloe. I did not say their names. I have spent the last few months establishing a foundation that will convert a residential property into transitional housing for disabled female veterans. That home, located on Seacliff Road, will no longer be occupied by private interests. The eviction notices will be served tomorrow morning. The deed has been reassigned to the foundation. The locks will be changed. The legal work is complete. A few soft gasps rippled through the room, but I kept my voice calm. Some of you may know the house. It has been my home for over 3 decades. It was taken from me under false pretenses while I was undergoing life-threatening procedures with no family by my side. That ends now. I sat back down. There was no applause, just a silence so sharp you could feel it. Mark looked as if he'd been slapped. Chloe's mouth hung open, but no words came out. An older veteran named Rosalind, seated next to me, leaned in and whispered. That was cleaner than a sniper's shot. They tried to approach me after dessert. You set us up, Mark hissed, his voice low and furious. I set the record straight, I replied coolly. Everything else you did to yourselves. Chloe stepped forward. You're ruining everything for no reason. I turned to her, my voice dropping to a whisper. You sold my husband's watch on eBay. You wore my scarves. You sat at my table and called it your home. It's not. They left in a storm of angry silence. I didn't watch them go. In the parking lot, I could see them arguing next to my old car. They didn't realize the registration had already been revoked. The plates would be pulled by morning. Let them drive it one last time. Let them hold on to the illusion a little longer. The legal filings would hit their desks by Monday. Fraud, perjury, misappropriation of assets. The damage was only beginning. But that night, I had done what I came to do. I had reclaimed not just a house, but my dignity, and I did it in front of the very people who thought I was too broken to ever rise again. By the time Monday came, the storm was fully unleashed. The eviction notice was served at 7:30 a.m. A uniformed sheriff's deputy handed Mark the envelope as he stood in the driveway, coffee in hand. Maria had a volunteer nearby to document it. She texted me 3 words: "It is done." The legal filings landed just after lunch. My new attorney, Isabel, had prepared everything like a master strategist. By Tuesday, their personal bank accounts were frozen pending investigation. Chloe called my old neighbor, sobbing about legal harassment. The neighbor called me. I told her gently, "This isn't harassment, it's accountability." They had taken loans against the property in my name. They had sold my personal belongings in online auctions. They had tried to transfer the car title while I was unconscious in a recovery unit. Every transaction left a digital trail. By Thursday, they were served a court summons. The civil penalties alone would be enough to ruin them. That Friday, I received a text from my grandson. He was 22, a good kid before Chloe's influence took hold. "Grandma, I didn't know. I'm sorry." I read it twice, then deleted it. Some wounds don't heal with apologies. They require the clean removal of the infection. That evening, I sat in my small rented apartment on Laurel Street. It was modest, but it was mine. I made tea and watched the sunset paint the sky over Puget Sound. I thought about the house, about the day I carried Paul across the threshold after his final deployment. The place wasn't my home anymore, not because they had taken it, but because I had willingly given it up to something bigger than myself. To women like Rosalind, who had nowhere to go, they would fight, of course. They would twist the story and call it unfair. But I no longer lived in a world where their opinions mattered. I had started to sleep with my legs elevated, per doctor's orders. The pain still flared at night, but it was no longer a warning, it was just a memory. A reporter got wind of the case. Isabel asked if I wanted to make a statement. I declined. Let the facts speak. Let my silence be louder than their excuses. They had tried to erase me from my own story, but I had rewritten it in ink they could never wash away. This wasn't the ending. This was the collapse before the calm, and I would be ready for what came next. It was the last Saturday of the month. The rain had just stopped, and the wet pavement of Seacliff Road glistened. I had requested a final meeting at the house. Isabel insisted on coming, but I asked her to wait in the car. This was mine to face alone. Chloe opened the door. She looked thinner, her face tight with bitterness. She stepped aside without a word. Mark was already in the living room, a folder in his lap. He looked exhausted. The power had been draining from him since the first legal notice arrived. Now it was almost gone. "I'm not here to listen," I said, my voice steady. "I'm here to speak once." He nodded barely. "I built this house not with hammers, but with nights I skipped dinner so you could have seconds. With jobs I worked while your father was dying. You signed it away while I was under anesthesia." "I sent flowers," he mumbled. "They died in 3 days," I replied. "I stayed alive." The silence stretched. "Every dollar you moved, every document you forged, every lie you told your children. I have it all. Emails, bank logs, witnesses. I know everything." His eyes flinched. "You thought I would die. You counted on it. But I came back." Chloe finally spoke, her voice sharp as glass. "We did what we had to do. You abandoned this family. I served this country," I shot back. "I paid the mortgage from halfway across the world. I raised you while your own mother worked 10-hour shifts and still found time to blame me for being tired." "You never understood," she snapped. "I understood everything," I said calmly. "Especially when I read the text you sent Mark the night you filed the quitclaim deed. I have it. You wrote, 'It's finally all ours. The old bird won't last the winter anyway.'" Mark didn't look up. "You didn't just betray me," I said. You desecrated everything this house stood for. And now, everything that came from my hand will be turned away from yours. You could have just talked to me, Mark said, his eyes wet. I stared at the man who was once my son. I talked for years, Mark. You just stopped listening. I stood. This is my last visit, not to this house, to you. Are you cutting me off? He asked, his voice cracking. I am restoring the order you violated. Consider this the last chapter you get to write in my story. I walked out, closing the door softly behind me. As we drove away, I saw the house in the rearview mirror. For the first time, it looked truly empty. That was the day I buried what was left of them and stepped fully into what was left of me. My name was never mentioned in the headlines that followed, but the story was there. Local philanthropist freezes family assets, donates estate to veterans. The Viola Legacy Fund launched to support vulnerable women. The foundation was named after my mother. She had raised me with 2 aprons and no time off. She never owned property, but she never bowed her head either. The fund, just under $2.4 million that I had quietly accrued from investments Mark and Chloe never knew existed, activated in stages. The quiet buzz grew. Mark and Chloe were beginning to understand. This wasn't just about reclaiming a house. It was about rewriting the meaning of family. It's not about blood. It's about who shows up, who answers when you're at gate B6 at 11:40 after 14 months in a hospital ward. I wrote one final letter to the Foundation's Board of Trustees. It said, "Make sure no woman ever has to plead for her worth to be recognized. And if she must fight, make sure she has sharper weapons than silence." The family line had been cut, the legacy had been redirected, and somewhere in the fog of everything they had lost, I hoped my son would finally see. This wasn't punishment. It was a revelation. Not everything that dies becomes dirt. Some things become seeds, and I was just beginning to plant.